It was a frozen January night in 1944 when the phone on Adolf Hitler's desk began to ring. The sound cut through the stone corridors of the Reich chancellery like a blade. Outside, Berlin slept under a curtain of snow, the streets silent except for the distant rumble of anti-aircraft guns testing the sky. Inside, the Führer reached for the receiver with the impatience of a man used to bad news. On the line was General Erich Keller, commander of the Southern Luftwaffe. His voice trembled not with fear, but with something rarer among German officers: confusion. "Mein Führer," he said, measuring every word, "the Americans have deployed a new fighter group. They fly P-51 Mustangs with red-painted tails. They do not break formation. They do not chase kills. In 6 months of combat, not one bomber under their escort has been lost." For a long moment, there was only the hum of the line. Hitler's knuckles whitened around the receiver. "Impossible," he whispered. "Americans don't fly like that." He rose from his chair, the shadows of the bunker stretching across the maps pinned to the wall. Keller repeated the numbers, but mathematics meant nothing when pride was bleeding. The Luftwaffe had been the master of Europe's skies for years, its aces legends, its tactics doctrine. Yet now, a handful of American pilots had done what thousands of his own could not: protect every bomber that crossed the Reich. Hitler set the receiver down and stared at the map table glowing under the red lamp. He ordered his aide to bring the reconnaissance charts. One by one, red pins marked the bomber routes from Italy to Munich, Vienna, Regensburg. Each route carried a new symbol, a streak of crimson paint at its tail. The aide hesitated. "Sir, our analysts say the pilots are exceptionally disciplined. Some reports claim their formation flying is mechanical, almost unnatural." Hitler's eyes narrowed. "Machines do not feel loyalty. These are men. Find out who commands them." His voice, low and deliberate, filled the room like smoke. "Find them, and bring me their name." The aide bowed and disappeared into the corridor, leaving Hitler alone with the sound of his own breathing and the steady ticking of the wall clock. 3:52 a.m. The Führer traced the red lines with his finger, each one ending in a point of failure for his own air force. Outside, the wind scraped the windows like distant whispers. He thought of his speeches, of the promises of superiority carved into banners and marble, and felt the first hairline fracture in that certainty. In a war measured by numbers and ideology, this report defied both. Somewhere beyond the Alps, a squadron of Americans had rewritten the laws of air combat, and by every rule his empire taught, they should not have existed. He reached for the phone again, this time not to answer, but to command. "Issue an inquiry to all Luftwaffe sectors. I want every detail: tactics, markings, base of origin. No rest until we know who these red-tailed devils are." His aide saluted and hurried off as Hitler turned back to the window. Snow fell softly over the city that still believed in his invincibility. He pressed a hand against the glass and whispered, "It's a lie. It must be." Yet somewhere deep inside, the thought took root. What if the lie wasn't theirs? What if the lie was his own? What Hitler didn't know was that those red-tailed pilots weren't the men his ideology believed could even fly. Thousands of miles away, in the rolling fields of Tuskegee, Alabama, the morning sun cut through the mist that clung to rows of weather-beaten aircraft. Engines coughed, propellers spun, and the air trembled with the effort of men who had waited their whole lives for permission to fly. Captain Elijah Eli Carter wiped the grease from his hands and looked toward the sky that had too long belonged to others. He was 27, the son of a mechanic from Chicago, with eyes that carried both exhaustion and quiet fire. Behind him, a row of cadets waited for their turn in the P-40 Warhawk trainers, machines that rattled, leaked oil, and demanded respect. Over them stood Colonel Thomas Avery Davis, commander of the 332nd Fighter Group, a man whose patience had been tested by years of bureaucracy that tried to ground him before he ever touched a cockpit. The South had not welcomed them kindly. At the local diner, a whites-only sign hung crooked in the window, and some residents refused to fuel the Army trucks when they saw who was driving. But on this dusty airfield, something rare was forming, an unshakable discipline born from being doubted at every turn. They flew in formation so tight that a careless twitch could shear a wing, and yet they made it look effortless. Their instructors, most of them skeptical at first, began to exchange glances of disbelief as the cadets executed perfect takeoffs and landings in aircraft others called death traps. When Roosevelt's administration finally approved combat deployment for the colored airmen, the news rippled through the base like electricity. For years they had been told they would never see Europe, that the skies above the war were no place for men like them. But now orders came stamped with a single word: active. As the men gathered in the mess hall, Colonel Davis stood at the front, his voice steady and deliberate. "Gentlemen, you've earned your wings in a country that still doubts you. Remember that every time you take off, you're not just fighting the enemy across the ocean. You're fighting the enemy of small minds back home." The room fell silent. Even the ceiling fan seemed to pause. Outside, Eli Carter ran his fingers along the dull metal of his Mustang's fuselage, tracing the curve of its tail. The squadron had been given permission to choose their own markings, and he'd insisted the tail be painted a bright, defiant red. "We'll make sure they remember us," he told his crew chief. The man smiled, shaking his head. "They already will, Captain. They just don't know it yet." Training intensified. Instructors demanded perfection. Tight turns, energy management, long-range escort drills. The men responded not with bravado, but with precision. They learned to read each other's moves like silent code. When one pilot banked, the others shifted instantly, closing gaps invisible to the eye. It wasn't talent born of arrogance, it was survival born of exclusion. They knew that one mistake would not only cost lives, but confirm every prejudice that shadowed them. Letters from home reminded them of a world that hadn't changed. Segregation in the streets, separate barracks, the sting of words they were too tired to repeat. But up there, above the clouds, color disappeared. The only line that mattered was the horizon. As weeks passed, rumors drifted in from the front. Stories of bomber crews desperate for competent escorts, of German fighters tearing through formations unchallenged. The 332nd's assignment was clear. They would protect those bombers no matter what. And when Colonel Davis briefed them before their deployment to Italy, his orders were simple. "You will stay with the bombers. You will not chase glory. If you lose one, you answer to me." Eli Carter nodded, understanding the weight of that promise. In February 1944, the Red Tails crossed the Atlantic, their Mustangs glinting under Mediterranean sun. From above, they looked like sparks streaking across blue water, defiant and alive. When they landed at Ramatelli Airfield in southern Italy, the white crews already stationed there watched in silence, unsure whether to salute or stare. The first few missions were quiet, short-range escorts over the Adriatic, but soon the real test arrived. Orders came to guard a bomber formation bound for Munich. It was a target deep inside enemy territory, and every man knew the Luftwaffe would be waiting. The night before takeoff, Eli sat in his tent writing to his mother. "We fly tomorrow," he wrote. "They say the Germans own the sky. Maybe they do, but I've never believed anyone owns the wind." He folded the letter and slipped it into his jacket. Outside, the red tails of 20 Mustangs glowed faintly under the floodlights, lined up like sentinels. The sound of distant artillery echoed through the valley, a low reminder of what awaited them beyond the mountains. At dawn, engines roared to life, and the red tails rose into the pale sky. Men who had once been told they were incapable of flight, now carrying the hopes of a nation that still hadn't learned how to see them. As they climbed higher, Eli glanced down at the fields of Italy shrinking beneath him and whispered, "Let them watch." What neither he nor his commander could know was that far to the north, in a darkened war room, Adolf Hitler was already watching, and his obsession was only beginning. Hundreds of miles away in southern Germany, the morning sky over Stuttgart glowed with a thin veil of frost as Major Franz Adler adjusted his oxygen mask and scanned the horizon. He was 32 years old, a veteran of more than 300 sorties, and a man whose pride had survived every reversal the war had dealt him. From his cockpit high above the Bavarian plains, Adler could recognize an aircraft type by the shape of its shadow on the clouds. That morning, he saw them, specks of silver flanking a tight formation of B-17 bombers crawling across the sky. But something about their escort made him pause. The fighters weren't weaving or breaking rank. They were flying as if bound by an invisible thread. Through his scope, he saw the glint of sunlight on crimson tails. The red-tailed Mustangs had entered his airspace. "Formation locked. Altitude 26,000, his wingman radioed. Adler smiled beneath his mask. "Then let's remind them whose sky this is." He rolled his Focke-Wulf into a dive, engines screaming. Below him, the B-17s lumbered on, their defensive guns flashing in the cold light. The Mustangs didn't flinch. They shifted slightly, their geometry perfect, closing gaps with machine precision. Adler's first burst of cannon fire cut through empty air. He adjusted, dove again, faster. Then he saw it. One Mustang breaking formation, climbing toward him, not in panic, but with purpose. The maneuver didn't make sense. By every rule of dogfighting, it was suicide. He pulled back on the stick, trying to anticipate, but the American pilot had already turned inside his arc. Tracer rounds stitched the air across Adler's left wing. "Scheisse!" he hissed, leveling out, smoke trailing behind. For the first time in months, he felt outthought, not just outflown. He climbed back to regroup, heart hammering. Below, the bombers held formation, untouched. The red tails circled them like guardians of an invisible wall. After 10 minutes of combat, Adler called off the attack. His radio crackled with confusion from other squadrons. "They don't chase, they just stay with the bombers," one shouted. "Then break them apart," another barked. But no one could. When Adler's unit landed later that morning, his ground crew stared at the bullet holes across his fuselage. He tore off his gloves and strode straight to the command post, his breath still ragged. "They fly differently," he told his superior. "They're disciplined, unnatural, like chess pieces anticipating every move." His report moved up the chain quickly, landing on the desk of Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring. In Berlin, the Führer demanded to see it himself, though, following evening, Hitler sat beneath the harsh light of a desk lamp. The report spread before him. The words were precise, clinical, impossible to reconcile with his belief in the natural order. Exceptional coordination, 0 bomber losses, unidentified American pilots with red-painted tails. He looked up at Göring. "You say they are American, but who are they?" Göring hesitated. "Reconnaissance photographs from our Italian sector may answer that." He slid a folder across the table. Inside were grainy images taken from a high-altitude reconnaissance plane. Men climbing from Mustangs at an Italian airfield. Even in the blurred frames, the truth was visible. Their faces, their skin. Hitler stared at the photos for a long time, silent. The myth he had built, the hierarchy he had preached, trembled under the weight of simple evidence. "Negro pilots?" he said finally, the words thin as glass. "Impossible." Göring didn't respond. The silence between them was heavy enough to bend air. Hitler leaned forward, his voice sharpening. "Do you understand what this means? If this becomes known, every German will question everything we've told them." He stood, pacing. "If inferior men can do this, then our entire order is built on sand." Goering swallowed hard, saying nothing. Hitler's anger didn't explode. It condensed, cold and surgical. No one speaks of this. Suppress every mention of their race. And if these pilots exist, they will cease to exist. He turned toward the map wall, the red lines of bomber routes glowing under the lamplight. The Americans call them red tails. Fine. Then paint their tails with their own blood. Meanwhile, back in Italy, Eli Carter and the men of the 332nd returned to Ramatelli after the Munich run. They were exhausted, but exhilarated. Their bombers untouched, their formations unbroken. When Eli climbed out of his Mustang, his mechanic greeted him with a grin. "Not a scratch, Captain. You boys fly like ghosts." Eli smiled faintly, looking at the red tail of his plane now streaked with powder burns and soot. "Ghosts don't bleed," he said quietly, unaware that in Berlin, a man who ruled by lies had just decided to make sure they did. Would Hitler's next move be to silence them? Or would the truth these pilots represented prove stronger than his fury? At the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's headquarters buried deep in the East Prussian forest, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and unease. The winter outside clawed at the windows, and inside a half-circle of the Reich's most powerful men waited as Hitler studied the reconnaissance photographs on the table before him. Beside him stood Goering, Goebbels, and Himmler, three architects of a collapsing empire, each pretending not to notice how pale the Führer had become. The room was silent except for the soft hiss of the fireplace. "So," Hitler began, his voice calm but brittle, "they are Negro pilots." Goebbels nodded once, choosing his words carefully. "Yes, my Führer. Trained in Alabama, we believe. Their unit designation, 332nd Fighter Group. They escort bombers over our southern territories. Their performance statistics are exceptional." Hitler's hand trembled as he tapped one of the photographs. "Exceptional," he repeated, the word dripping with contempt. "Our pilots call them disciplined, intelligent, fearless." He turned sharply toward Goering. "And yet, according to your reports, we are losing bombers at a rate of 20% when these red tails are present. How do you explain that?" Goering shifted his weight, his voice heavy with rehearsed excuses about fuel shortages and overextended squadrons, but Hitler cut him off. "No, this is not about resources. This is about humiliation." He slammed his palm against the map. "Find them, erase them, and bury the evidence of what they are." The order carried more than anger. It carried fear. Himmler leaned forward, eyes cold and calculating. "Mein Führer, we could initiate a special operation, sabotage their base of operations in Italy, cut the head off the snake." Hitler nodded slowly, as if the idea had already been living in his mind. "Yes, Operation Black Silence. It will appear as partisan activity. I want their planes destroyed on the ground. No witnesses, no records." Goebbels, always the propagandist, added, "And their existence? What shall the German people be told?" Hitler didn't look up. "Nothing. If they are mentioned at all, call them a fabrication. American propaganda. Do you understand? The idea of Negro pilots defeating our best will never reach the streets of Berlin." He turned back to the window, where snow drifted like ashes from a dying fire. "We will make the world forget them before history can remember." Across the continent, unaware of the storm gathering, Eli Carter sat in his tent at Ramatelli writing his mother another letter. The candlelight flickered over his face as he described the Italian countryside, the smell of olives, the children waving at their planes. He didn't mention the fatigue or the constant raids at night, the whistle of falling shells, the uneasy sense that the Luftwaffe's attention was shifting toward them. Outside, the men of the 332nd cleaned their planes, checked ammunition, and painted over the chipped red on their tails. Each mark of wear felt like a scar earned. Colonel Davis walked the line of aircraft, his coat dusted with frost. "No one touches a bomber under our protection," he said quietly, almost to himself. "That's the mission. That's the promise." He didn't know that in Berlin another man had whispered a promise of his own, that they would not live to keep it. Within days, the first signs of the operation began to unfold. German intelligence units planted rumors among Italian partisans, bribing them to move weapons near Allied airfields. Messages were intercepted, coded, and dismissed as routine noise. No one suspected that those codes marked the beginning of one of the war's quietest and deadliest campaigns. Back in the wolf's lair, Hitler studied the lines on his maps as if they were veins of his own body. "They humiliate us in the air," he muttered. "So we will strike where they sleep." Goering hesitated, the soldier in him recoiling from the idea of killing men on the ground. "Mein Führer, perhaps a direct engagement would restore confidence, a decisive air victory." Hitler turned to him, eyes like cold iron. "Do you think this is about confidence? It is about control. If the world learns that black pilots are superior to Aryans, every lie we have told collapses. The empire falls, not from bombs, but from shame." He turned back to the map and traced a finger toward southern Italy. "We cannot lose to truth. Truth must lose to us." In Rome, Allied intelligence noted an unusual spike in encrypted German transmissions. Analysts flagged it as increased Luftwaffe coordination, unaware that the real threat wasn't in the air. And on a foggy night in early March, German agents crossed the Apennines disguised as local laborers, carrying crates of explosives marked as farm equipment. They moved silently toward Ramatelli. In the days leading up to the attack, Eli noticed small changes: local vendors growing distant, fewer villagers near the base, a strange unease in the air. "Something's off," he told his wingman, Lieutenant Samuel Reed. "You ever get the feeling we're being watched?" Reed laughed softly, brushing it off. "In this war, we're always being watched, Captain. Question is, by who?" They didn't have to wait long for an answer, because in the dead of night, as the men of the Red Tails slept beneath canvas tents and the snow fell quietly across their airstrip, shadows crept between the rows of planes. The first detonation came from the fuel depot, a blinding flash that split the night in half. Eli woke to the shockwave, the world shaking around him, the air thick with smoke and screams. He grabbed his flight jacket and ran into the firestorm, unaware that this was not an accident of war, but the opening act of something far darker. The Red Tails had survived every enemy in the sky. But what they faced now would come from the ground, from the very hatred that had tried to deny their existence. And as dawn began to break over the burning ruins of Ramatelli, one question hung in the air like smoke. Would courage be enough when the enemy refused to fight by the rules of war? The explosion had torn through the airfield at exactly 3:45 a.m., ripping tents from their moorings and turning the night into a storm of flame. Eli Carter hit the frozen ground before his mind could catch up to the chaos around him. Fuel drums ignited in a chain reaction, lighting the Italian hills with waves of orange fire. Mechanics scrambled barefoot across the icy mud, trying to drag ammunition crates away from the inferno. Every sound, the roar of burning engines, the crack of bursting shells, the screams for water, merged into one endless note of disbelief. When the fires finally died hours later, 3 P-51 Mustangs were gone, their aluminum shells melted into puddles of twisted metal. 2 mechanics had been found near the hangar, their bodies unrecognizable under sheets of soot. For the men of the 352nd, it wasn't just a loss of equipment. It was a wound carved into their belief that hard work could keep evil at bay. The military police arrived before noon. Clipboards in hand, they questioned exhausted witnesses, checked safety logs, and by evening filed their report. Accidental fuel vapor ignition. That was the official conclusion. Colonel Davis read it twice, his expression unreadable. He looked out the window toward the hangar ruins where smoke still rose. "You ever smelled diesel and dynamite together?" he asked quietly. The investigator shook his head, unsure how to respond. Davis sighed. "Then you wouldn't know it when you did." When Eli walked in a few minutes later, his uniform still smudged with ash, Davis didn't look up from his desk. "You think it was an accident?" Eli asked. Davis didn't answer. He just folded the report and slid it into a drawer. "Officially, yes," he said. "Unofficially, no." That night, the base felt different. The men spoke in whispers, as if loud voices might attract another disaster. The mess hall was half empty. Some couldn't eat at all. In the distance, the wrecked hangar glowed faintly like a wound that refused to heal. Within days, more strange events followed. A supply truck lost its brakes on a downhill road, crashing into a parked aircraft. 2 pilots fell violently ill after breakfast, their rations later found to be contaminated. Then the unthinkable. Lieutenant Samuel Reed went missing after a mission near Vienna. Search planes found no wreckage, no parachute, nothing. 3 days later, an Italian farmer stumbled upon his body 20 miles from the base. Reed had survived his crash landing, but his execution-style wounds left no doubt about what had happened. Pinned to his flight suit was a single note typed in German. "This is what happens to inferior races who challenge their betters." When Colonel Davis read it, his jaw tightened, but his eyes remained steady. "We knew they hated us," he said softly. "Now we know they fear us." The note was sent up the chain of command, but the response came back cold and bureaucratic. "Unverified enemy propaganda. Recommend silence until confirmation." Davis folded the message and placed it beside Reed's photo on his desk. "They want silence," he muttered. "They'll get discipline, but not silence." That evening, he met privately with Eli and the other flight leaders. "We can't count on Washington," he told them. "We protect our own." He outlined new security rotations, pairing pilots with ground crew to stand watch overnight. Every entry point to the base was reinforced. They installed improvised alarms, empty fuel cans strung with wire that would rattle if touched. No one slept easily, but everyone stayed ready. Within a week, their vigilance paid off. A sentry caught a shadow moving near the fuel depot, a man dressed as a local farmer carrying what looked like a crate of vegetables. Inside were explosives disguised as canned goods. The infiltrator confessed under interrogation that he had been paid by German intelligence through partisan channels. His orders were clear: sabotage the Red Tail's operations by any means necessary. For Davis, it was confirmation of everything he'd suspected. For the men, it was the moment innocence turned to resolve. "If they want to fight dirty," Eli said, "then they'll learn we don't scare easy." But the toll was already visible. Pilots flew with tired eyes. Every noise at night made them reach for their pistols. Some wrote letters home and left them unsealed, just in case. War had always been dangerous. But this was personal. The Germans weren't just trying to win battles. They were trying to erase an idea. The idea that excellence could come from those deemed unworthy of it. In late March, Davis requested an emergency meeting with General Ira Eaker in Naples. The general's office overlooked the harbor where ships moved like silent shadows under blackout conditions. Davis stood straight, his uniform immaculate, his voice restrained but fierce. "My men are being targeted on the ground," he said. "This isn't coincidence, sir. It's strategy. They're trying to break us without admitting we exist." Eaker listened carefully, his expression caught between sympathy and calculation. "Colonel," If we go public with this, we'll be forced to address issues that go beyond this war. Segregation, politics. You understand? I understand, Davis replied, that Lieutenant Reed is dead because someone thought he didn't deserve to fly. And if we pretend it didn't happen, we prove them right. The silence stretched for several seconds before Eaker leaned back. I'll assign counterintelligence support, quietly. You'll have OSS specialists at Ramatelli within a week. But no press, no statements. This stays off the record. Davis nodded, knowing it was the best he would get. Back at the base, the arrival of OSS officers changed everything. They brought new security protocols, checked every civilian worker, and began dismantling local networks feeding information to the Germans. Yet even as they tightened defenses, the cost of living under constant threat grew heavier. The pilots trained by day, guarded by night, and flew missions through skies filled with flak by dawn. It was endurance beyond duty. One night, as Eli stood outside his tent watching the Italian horizon flicker with distant artillery, he heard Davis behind him. You think we can outlast this? Davis asked quietly. Eli didn't turn. We already have, sir. We just haven't landed yet. Neither man spoke again. The wind carried the faint scent of smoke from the burned hangar, a reminder of how close hatred had come. But in their silence lay a promise, the same one that carried them through every mission. They would not be broken. Not by bombs, not by bullets, not by the lies that fed the war itself. What they didn't know was that the more they endured, the deeper Hitler's obsession grew, and soon his orders would escalate beyond sabotage. The next phase would be darker still, a war not just for survival, but for the soul of the truth itself. Would they survive what was coming, or would the sky that once protected them become the very trap designed to end them? By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was cracking under its own weight. Cities lay in ruins, and the once mighty Luftwaffe was a ghost of its former self. Yet even as Allied armies closed in, Hitler's focus had narrowed to a single fixation: the red tails. Inside his bunker beneath the Reich chancellery, he spent hours hunched over maps, demanding updates on their missions, studying photographs that had long since lost strategic meaning. His generals tried to divert him: reports from the Eastern Front, supply shortages, the encirclement of Berlin. But he returned always to the same question. Were they there? The ones with the red tails? When told yes, he would pace in silence, his mind unraveling. 68 consecutive missions, one aide reported, and not a single bomber lost under their escort. Hitler stared at the paper as if numbers could betray him. Reality is lying to me, he muttered. It must be lying. But reality was not lying. It was recording the slow, unstoppable collapse of a false belief system that could no longer survive contact with truth. Meanwhile, far south in Italy, Captain Eli Carter sat inside his cockpit, hands resting on the throttle as the Mustang's engine hummed beneath him. The mission briefing had been short: escort bombers over Munich, defend them at all costs. He'd flown the route a dozen times, but something about this morning felt final. As the formation climbed, sunlight cut through a thin veil of clouds, bathing the silver bombers in gold. Through the radio came the calm, familiar voice of Colonel Davis. Remember your discipline, boys. The sky doesn't forgive pride. Eli smiled faintly. Copy that, sir. Above the Alps, the horizon stretched endless and clear, a reminder of how small the world below had become. Then the German fighters appeared, 30 or more, diving from the east. The Luftwaffe's last stand. For the next 20 minutes, the sky became a storm of fire and motion. Tracers crossed in red and white arcs. Engines screamed in agony. Eli led his squadron through a rolling turn, positioning his wingmen between the bombers and the attack. Hold formation, he called out. Let them come to us. A Messerschmitt streaked past, guns flashing. Eli's reply was a controlled burst that struck its wing root. The plane spiraled downward in smoke. He didn't cheer. There was no joy in this kind of killing, only necessity. By the time the bombers released their payloads over Munich's railway yards, 6 German fighters were down, and the rest had fled. Not one bomber lost. Not one. When the Red Tails landed hours later, exhausted and coated in grime, Colonel Davis was waiting on the tarmac. He didn't speak at first. He just nodded, a silent acknowledgement of something larger than victory. The mechanics began painting fresh symbols on the fuselages, white stars marking missions completed without loss. Nearby, Eli pulled a crumpled letter from his jacket pocket, one he'd written weeks earlier but never mailed. "Mom," it began, "if we fall, remember we flew higher than anyone thought we could." He stared at the words for a long time, then folded the paper again and slipped it back into his chest pocket. That night, news traveled faster than the wind. The mission had been flawless, the statistics irrefutable. In Berlin, the report reached Hitler's desk within hours. Munich rail yards destroyed. 0 bomber losses under escort. The Führer's hand shook as he read. His aides waited for an explosion, but none came. Instead, a strange calm settled over him. "So it is decided," he said quietly. "If the world insists that Negro pilots can outfly my best, then the world itself is wrong." He stood, looking around the room at men who no longer believed in anything. History will remember only what we let it remember. But history had already begun to remember. Across Germany, Luftwaffe pilots whispered of the red-tailed Americans who flew with impossible precision. Even in defeat, they spoke of them with reluctant admiration. One captured pilot reportedly said, "They don't fly for medals, they fly for something we've forgotten." As the Reich crumbled, Hitler's denial deepened. He refused to authorize further air operations that mentioned the Red Tails by name, striking them from records as if erasing their existence could rewrite reality. But the war no longer obeyed him. The walls of his bunker shook with the thunder of Allied artillery. In his final days, he shuffled through stacks of reports, each one a reminder that his carefully constructed myth of superiority had been undone by men he had once deemed incapable of greatness. He called it betrayal by reality itself. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The 1,000-year Reich lasted just 12. The men of the 332nd Fighter Group stood on the Ramatelli airfield as flares lit the night sky in celebration. Around them, Italian villagers sang and soldiers embraced. Eli watched as a mechanic finished painting the final tally on his Mustang. 179 bomber escort missions, none lost to enemy fighters. Colonel Davis approached, his coat unbuttoned, his face lined with exhaustion and pride. "You did good, Eli," he said. "We did what we came here to do." Eli looked at the red tail of his plane catching the evening light. "We proved something, sir. Maybe not to them, but to ourselves." Davis nodded. "We didn't just protect bombers, Eli. We protected the truth." The next morning, the Red Tails prepared for departure. Their planes were worn but unbroken. The paint faded from months of war. As Eli climbed aboard, he looked one last time at the hills of Italy, at the runway that had nearly become their grave. He throttled forward, the Mustang leaping into the sky that had tried so many times to kill them. Below, the ground shrank away, the air clear and endless once again. In Berlin, the man who had tried to erase them lay silent, his empire in ashes, but the truth he'd tried to destroy had already taken flight. The Red Tails had rewritten history not through vengeance or hate, but through excellence and endurance. Their victory didn't end with the war. It began there. And as their planes disappeared into the horizon, a quiet certainty remained. Some lies can build empires, but only truth can make them fall. Would the world remember that lesson? Or would it need to be learned again?